My name is Nadia Calloway, and I was 31 years old when my mother slid an envelope across the dinner table and told me that if I married Daniel Reyes, I would no longer exist to her family. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She picked up her wine glass, took a slow sip, and said, "We've discussed it as a family. If you go through with this, we won't be able to support you in any way, financially, publicly, or privately. That's not a threat. That's just the reality of the choice you're making." Daniel was sitting right there. He set down his fork, folded his napkin, and said, "That's fine." 2 words.
No anger.
No defense. Just 2 words and a steady pair of hands resting on the table. What my mother didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Daniel had something sitting quietly in his name that would eventually walk into the same room as her. She'd helped build the industry that made it possible. She just didn't know she'd done it. 14 months later, 400 guests filled the Clearwater Harbor Gala. My mother was one of them. And when she saw the name on the building she'd just walked into, something changed in her face that I don't think she'd planned on anyone watching. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let the paperwork do the talking. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe. A new story drops every week, and the comment section is full of people who've lived some version of this too. I grew up understanding very early that in my family, love came with a ledger. My mother, Constance Calloway, built her shipping logistics company from a regional freight office in Clearwater, Florida, into a mid-size empire that moved cargo along the Gulf Coast. By the time I was in high school, she had 47 employees, 2 warehouse facilities, and a name that people in maritime business circles recognized without needing a last name attached. Just Constance. People said it the way you say a weather system, matter-of-factly, with a little caution underneath. My father, Warren, was a quieter figure. He'd come from money himself, old Tampa real estate, but he'd folded himself into my mother's world somewhere in the early years of their marriage and never quite unfolded again. He was kind to me in private. In public, or at the dinner table when decisions were being made, he deferred. He had a way of looking at his plate at exactly the right moment, and I learned as a child that this was not weakness, it was strategy. He'd made a calculation long ago about which battles were worth having, and he'd drawn the lines somewhere I couldn't see. My older sister, Petra, had made the right choices. That was how it was framed in our house. Choices. Petra had gone to Tulane, joined the company at 24 as a logistics coordinator, married a man named Griffin who came from a family in commercial real estate, and by 30 was managing 2 of the warehouse accounts. She was not particularly warm. She was competent in the way that machines are competent, reliably, without texture. My mother spoke about Petra's decisions the way other people speak about good weather. Expected.
Deserved.
Nothing to remark on. I had gone a different direction. Not rebelliously. That's the thing people always assume, that if you don't follow the family plan, you must have been storming out of rooms, making speeches, wearing it like a flag. I wasn't like that. I was quiet about it. I got my degree in marine biology from the University of South Florida, spent 2 years doing coastal research with a nonprofit out of St. Pete, and then took a position with the Suncoast Water Quality Coalition, a small organization that monitored pollution levels in Gulf-adjacent waterways and published findings that mostly got ignored by the industries that needed to change. I made $38,000 a year. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Gulfport with a cat named Meridian and a second-hand kayak I kept on the balcony. My mother found this tolerable. That is the most honest word for it, tolerable. She had long ago accepted that I was not going to be Petra, but she still believed I was in a phase. The nonprofit work was a phase. The small apartment was a phase. The sensible, low-drama life I was living would eventually resolve into something she recognized. Then I met Daniel. The person who first introduced us was my mother's cousin, Irene, who exists at the edges of the Calloway family portrait, present at holidays, occasionally consulted on matters of taste, never given a seat at the actual table. Irene had no agenda. She simply knew Daniel Reyes from a fishing charter she'd taken out of Clearwater Harbor 2 summers before, and when she found out I was going to be at the same 4th of July cookout she was attending, she said, "You should meet this guy. You'll like him." She was not wrong. Daniel was 34 when I met him. He had the kind of face that registers as calm before anything else, Dark eyes, a stillness in his expression that you noticed immediately, the way you notice when a room stops echoing. He was running a commercial fishing operation out of the harbor. 2 boats, a small crew, mostly red snapper and grouper sold to wholesale buyers, and a few upscale restaurants along the coast. He knew the Gulf the way people who work in it know it, not as scenery but as a system. He talked about current patterns and seasonal migration the same way I talked about water chemistry, with the particular fluency of someone who has spent years paying close attention to something most people walk past. We talked for 4 hours at that cookout. He asked about my work. He had opinions about agricultural runoff. He knew which inlets I'd been sampling and why they were showing the numbers they were showing. He was not performing interest. He was actually interested. I drove home that night with something warm sitting in my chest, and I remember thinking, carefully, don't make this into more than it is. I had a habit of doing that, talking myself back from the edge of things before I'd even gotten close. It took 6 months before I stopped doing that with Daniel. By the time I introduced him to my family, we had been together 8 months. He had met Irene several times, had dinner with 2 of my close friends, had spent a weekend helping me survey a stretch of mangrove restoration site outside Sarasota because I needed an extra set of hands, and he'd asked what I was doing that weekend. He was not trying to impress anyone. He simply showed up when showing up was useful. My grandmother, Vera, met him before my mother did. Vera Calloway was 81 and lived in a small house in Dunedin that smelled like orange blossoms and old paper. She had been the anchor of the family before my mother took over that role, and she still held a kind of moral authority that nobody officially acknowledged but everyone instinctively navigated around. She had grown up fishing with her father off the Pinellas coast. She knew what the harbor looked like before the development. She had opinions about the water. When Daniel and I visited her on a Sunday in March, she made coffee, asked him 4 questions about the boats, about the crew, about which reefs he was working and why, and then looked at me while he was pouring sugar into his cup and gave a small nod. Not theatrical, just a nod. The kind that means, I see it too. That nod is the thing I held on to later, when everything else went sideways. I brought Daniel to my parents' house for dinner on a Thursday in April. My mother had prepared for it the way she prepared for vendor meetings. Research conducted, positions established, questions ready. She asked about his revenue. She asked about the boats, their age, their condition, their financing. She asked whether he had a growth plan. She used the phrase long-term viability, and I watched Daniel's jaw not tighten at all, which told me more about his composure than anything he'd said to me in 8 months. He answered every question directly. He was not defensive. He gave numbers when she asked for numbers. He explained the wholesale relationships, the restaurant contracts, the maintenance schedule. He said at one point, "It's not a scalable business in the conventional sense, but it's stable and it's mine." My mother smiled at that, and the smile did not reach her eyes. After dinner, while Daniel was helping my father carry plates to the kitchen, a gesture my father later told me privately he'd appreciated, my mother pulled me into the hallway and said, "He's a nice person, Nadia. I want you to know I can see that. But this is not a direction that makes sense for you." I said, "I'm not asking for it to make sense to you. I'm asking you to have dinner with him." She looked at me with a particular expression she reserved for logistics decisions that were technically possible but practically inadvisable. "We'll see how it develops," she said, and went back to the table. It developed into an engagement. Daniel proposed in February, on one of the boats, at dawn on the water. There were no guests. There was coffee in a thermos, a pelican sitting on the railing who did not seem interested in the occasion, and a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a simple gold band with a small sapphire that sat low on the setting. He said, "I want to build something with you. Not for anyone else. Just us." I said yes before he finished the sentence. I told my mother by phone the following evening. There was a pause on her end that lasted long enough to have a shape. Then she said, "I see. I'll need to talk to your father." Petra called me 2 days later. "Mom's upset," she said, in the tone she used for delivering information rather than comfort. "She's not going to pretend she isn't. You should know that before you start planning anything." I said I knew. "She's worried about what this says," Petra said. "About the family. About what people will think. Griffin's company works with her on 3 separate contracts. There are people they see at events who are going to ask questions. I remember the moment she said that, what people will think, and the way something went still in my sternum, not with anger but with a kind of sad clarity. I had understood for a long time that my mother's primary concern was legibility, what the family looked like from the outside, what story it told. I had hoped, somewhere naive and unexamined, that when it came down to a real thing, a person she'd met, a decision that was mine, the outside story would matter less than it did. It didn't. The family dinner where my mother issued the ultimatum happened on a Thursday in late February, 6 weeks after the engagement. My mother had asked us to come for dinner, and she'd been careful about the phrasing, come for dinner, not we need to talk, as though the informality would soften what she'd already decided to say. Warren was at the table. Petra and Griffin were at the table. Griffin was quiet the whole night in the particular way of a man who has been briefed, but is not required to participate. The food was good. My mother cooks well when she is preparing for something difficult. She channels the tension into the kitchen, and the result is always a better meal than the occasion warrants. We had grouper, which I recognized as a small, likely unconscious acknowledgement of Daniel's profession, or possibly its opposite. We made it through most of the meal without incident. My mother asked about my work at the coalition. She asked Daniel about the winter season, whether the red snapper harvest had been what he'd expected. He said it had been decent. She nodded. There was a version of that evening where things stayed in that register, carefully pleasant, conflict suspended, and I think a part of me was hoping for it. Then she set down her fork, placed her hands flat on the table, and looked at me. I want to say something, and I want to say it while we're all here because I think that's more honest than saying it in pieces. Daniel was still. I was still. We've thought about this carefully as a family, she said. Your father and I and Petra because she's involved in the company, and these decisions affect her too. What Nadia is planning, this marriage, isn't something we're able to get behind. And I don't mean emotionally. I mean practically. Daniel is a good person. I'm not questioning that. But Nadia, you have a place in this family that carries weight. The Callaway name carries weight in this industry and in this community. And the choice you're making undermines that in ways that I don't think you've fully considered. I said, I've considered it. You've considered how it feels, she said, not unkindly. That's different from considering what it means. There's a trust account in your name. There are assets that were intended for you as part of a larger plan for this family. If you go through with this, those things will be redirected. Not as punishment, I want to be clear about that. As a reflection of where you've placed yourself. The words where you've placed yourself landed somewhere below my ribs. Daniel had not moved. He was looking at the table, not in a way that suggested shame, but in a way that suggested he was giving her the space to finish. Marry him, and you're nothing to us, she said. And then, as if catching herself. That sounds harsh. I don't mean it harshly. I mean you'll have made a choice that puts you outside of what we're able to include you in. Professionally, financially, socially. That's a real consequence, and you deserve to understand it before you decide. There was a silence. Daniel picked up his water glass, took a sip, and set it down. Then he unfolded his napkin from his lap, placed it beside his plate, and said, That's fine. My mother looked at him for a moment. I don't think she'd expected that to be the response. I think she'd expected argument, or pleading, or at minimum some visible sign of distress that would confirm her read of the situation. Excuse me, she said. That's fine, he said again. No variation. Same tone. Thank you for dinner. It was very good. He looked at me. I looked back at him. Something in my chest loosened. Just slightly, the way a rope slackens when the tension changes direction. I said, We're going to go. Petra said, Nadia, she's trying to. I know what she's trying to do, I said. Not loud, not harsh. Just clear. I'll call you. We drove home mostly in silence. Somewhere on the bridge over the bay, Daniel reached over and put his hand on mine for a moment, then put it back on the wheel. The water below was dark and moving. I looked at it and thought about the conversation I'd have to have with Vera, and about the ring on my hand, and about the phrase where you've placed yourself, and about how a person's love can be so organized it becomes indistinguishable from policy. My mother followed through. The trust account was restructured within the month. I learned this from my father, who called me on a Wednesday morning with the careful, apologetic voice of a man delivering someone else's decision. He said, "It's about 400,000. It was earmarked for you. She's redirected it to a business account under Petra's division. I want you to know that he stopped. Started again. I think this will settle down. Give it time." I thanked him. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that time was not the operative variable. The wedding was small. Irene was there. Two of my friends from the coalition. Daniel's sister, a woman named Rosario, who flew in from Houston and hugged me for a long time before the ceremony and said nothing except welcome. His 3 crew members, cleaned up and slightly awkward in collared shirts, standing in a row with their hands at their sides like they'd been told to stand at attention. The boat in the background. The water catching light. My grandmother Vera sent a card. Inside she had written, "The right ones always end up making sense eventually. Love, Gran." My mother sent nothing. The Clearwater Harbor Gala was not a new event. It had been running for 11 years, an annual fundraiser for Gulf Coast maritime preservation, hosted at the harbor complex, attended by everyone whose livelihood or investment portfolio had any connection to the waterfront. Shipping companies, fishing operations, port development groups, environmental organizations. The Callaway Logistics name had been on the sponsor list for 8 of those 11 years. My mother had attended 7 of them. It was, for her, a professional obligation dressed in cocktail attire, a place to maintain relationships, exchange information, and be seen in the room where the industry gathered. I had attended twice, years ago, as my mother's daughter. I had not attended since. 14 months after the dinner where my mother had restructured my inheritance, the Clearwater Harbor Gala was held on a Friday evening in late April. The venue was the newly opened Reyes Maritime Center, a name that had appeared in the harbor development news the previous fall, mentioned in the Clearwater Gazette in a business brief that I had clipped and kept in a folder in my kitchen drawer, not because I needed to, but because I wanted something physical to hold. 400 invitations had gone out. The venue itself was part of the evening's occasion. A formal ribbon cutting had happened that afternoon, covered by the local business press, and the gala was the evening celebration. The building was a 2-story event and conference facility built directly on the harbor waterfront, with a wide glass facade that looked out over the water, warm lighting inside, and the name Reyes Maritime Center in brushed steel letters above the main entrance, each letter approximately 14 inches tall. Daniel and I arrived at 6:15. I was wearing a green dress I'd bought with my own paycheck, which felt important to me in a way I didn't fully examine. Daniel was in a dark jacket that Rosario had talked him into the previous Christmas, and he looked like himself, composed, unhurried, entirely at ease in a way that had nothing to do with the building behind him. We stood by the entrance for a moment. I looked at the letters above the door. He looked at them too. "You ready?" he said. "Yes," I said. We went inside. The room was already filling, 150 people at least by the time we arrived, and more coming through the doors behind us. I recognized faces from the maritime world, from environmental organizations I'd worked alongside, from the harbor office. Several people greeted Daniel with the particular warmth of people who have known someone a long time and respect them without needing to perform it. He introduced me to a harbor commissioner named Elliot who shook my hand and said he'd read my water quality reports. I thanked him and meant it. I did not look for my mother when we arrived. I was talking to the director of the coalition's Pinellas chapter near the bar when I felt, rather than saw, a shift in the room near the entrance. A change in the ambient sound, not louder, but different. More deliberate. I turned. My mother had walked in. She was in navy, her hair precisely done, the same pearl earrings she wore to every professional event. Beside her was my father, Warren, in a gray suit, looking as he always looked at these events, present, affable, slightly untethered. Behind them, Petra and Griffin. Petra had a new haircut. Griffin was already scanning the room for people worth talking to. My mother was doing what she always did on arrival, a practiced, systematic visual survey of the space, noting the quality of the setup, the caliber of the crowd, the details that would confirm or revise her read of the event. Her gaze moved across the room with the efficiency of long habit. It landed on the sign above the interior archway. The one that said Reyes Maritime Center in the same brushed steel lettering. I watched her read it. I watched her read it again. Her head did not move. Her expression did not change immediately. But something happened at the base of her throat, a very small tightening, the kind that comes before a recalibration, when information arrives that doesn't match the prepared framework. She looked across the room. She found me. I was standing 40 feet away with a glass of sparkling water and a coalition director who was still mid-sentence about phosphorus levels. I saw my mother's eyes land on me, then move to Daniel, who was to my left, now turned slightly toward the harbor commissioner he was speaking with, comfortable and unhurried in the room that had his name above the door. Her lips parted very slightly. She didn't move for a moment, just stood there in the entrance of the room. 400 people gathered around her, the harbor visible through the glass behind her, her daughter across the room, and the name of her daughter's fisherman husband on the building she'd just walked into. Warren said something to her quietly. She didn't respond. She was still looking. What my mother didn't know at that dinner 14 months ago, what she'd had no reason to know, and what I had not told her because she had not asked and because it was not hers to be told, was what Daniel had been building for the 3 years before we met. I'll explain it plainly. The way I eventually explained it to Vera on the phone the week after the gala, sitting on my balcony with Meridian asleep in my lap and the bay visible in the distance. Daniel's father, Aurelio Reyes, had worked the Gulf Coast fishing grounds for 30 years. He'd owned 2 boats of his own and had built a modest wholesale operation, nothing like what Daniel eventually developed, but a foundation. When Aurelio died of a heart attack 4 years before I met Daniel, he left both boats and a small parcel of waterfront property to Daniel and Rosario in equal shares. Rosario had no interest in the maritime business. She was a structural engineer in Houston, practical and direct, and she had sold her half share of the property to Daniel at assessed value because she trusted him to do something with it. The waterfront parcel was not large. It was approximately 1.2 acres of harbor-adjacent land in a section of Clearwater Harbor that had been undervalued for years because of aging infrastructure and unclear development rights. Daniel had spent 18 months, long before I met him, long before the cookout, long before any of this, working with a Clearwater maritime attorney named Ponce to clarify those development rights, petition for a rezoning designation, and secure a long-term harbor improvement grant through the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. The grant was federal pass-through money designated for waterfront infrastructure that supported both commercial fishing operations and conservation programming. The grant was for $2.8 million. He had not spent it on himself. He had partnered with a Clearwater-based marine architecture firm to design and build a harbor event and conference facility, the Reyes Maritime Center, that would generate ongoing revenue from events and corporate rentals while also hosting quarterly conservation programming in partnership with the Gulf Coast Environmental Network. My coalition was one of the 3 named partner organizations. I had not made that happen. It had already been in the documents when we met. He told me about it on our 3rd date, calmly, while we were eating takeout on his dock, as a piece of information he thought I'd find relevant given my work. I had not told my family. There was no moment where that felt necessary. They had made their decision. They had done their math. They had restructured my trust account and decided what Daniel was, and I had no obligation to update their spreadsheet. The deed for the Reyes Maritime Center was in Daniel's name, filed with Pinellas County in July of the previous year. The building had opened formally that afternoon. Across the room, the harbor commissioner Elliott was already making his way toward the small stage near the water-facing windows for the evening's brief formal program. He tapped the microphone twice. Good evening, everyone. Before we get to the part of the night where we actually enjoy ourselves, I want to take a few minutes to formally welcome you to the Reyes Maritime Center, this extraordinary new facility that I think is going to be a genuine anchor for this harbor community for a long time to come. Light applause from the room. The project began with a vision and a parcel of land and a grant proposal that, frankly, I've rarely seen executed with this kind of clarity and follow-through. I want to ask the person who made it happen to say a few words. Daniel set down his drink, excused himself from the conversation he'd been in, and walked to the stage with the same unhurried stride he had in every room. He took the microphone, thanked the commissioner, thanked the architecture firm, thanked the grant program and the conservation partners. He named my coalition specifically, looked at me briefly without ceremony, and then said, "My father worked this harbor for 30 years. I think he would have liked this building." That's the whole story, really. He handed the microphone back and walked off the stage to a room full of applause. I watched my mother through all of it. Her hands were clasped at her waist. Her jaw was set. Warren was beside her, and his expression was unreadable in the particular way of a man receiving information he'd suspected, but not confirmed. Petra was very still. Griffin had his hands in his pockets and was looking at the floor. A woman from the Harbor Development Office who had been standing near my mother turned to her and said, in the bright, conversational tone of someone making connection at a professional event, "Do you know the Reyes family? Incredible story. He's been building this for years, apparently." My mother said something in response that I couldn't hear from where I stood. But I watched her throat move when she swallowed, and I watched her lift her chin afterward in the small, involuntary way people do when they are reorganizing something they thought was already organized. I did not walk over. I turned back to my conversation. The coalition director was asking about a sampling project we had planned for the Lower Bay Corridor. I told her I was interested. I asked about the timeline. The harbor through the glass was dark and moving and full of lights from the boats at anchor. My mother called the following morning. I was at the kitchen table with coffee and Meridian and a report I was annotating, and my phone lit up with her name at 7:52, which is earlier than she typically calls anyone. I looked at it for a moment. Then I answered.
"Good morning," I said.
There was a pause. "I want to talk about last night." "Okay." "I didn't know," she said.
"About the building."
"About any of it. You could have told me." I thought about that for a moment. The idea that I could have, that there had been an opportunity, that she'd wanted information, and I'd withheld it. "I didn't think you were interested in information about Daniel's work," I said. Another pause.
"Nadia."
"That's not fair." "Mom," I said, and I kept my voice level. "You restructured my trust account in March. You declined to come to my wedding. You told me in front of my husband that I was nothing to you. At what point in those 14 months was I supposed to update you on his real estate development?" The silence on her end had a different texture now. Not the strategic silence of someone building toward an argument, but the heavier silence of someone sitting with something they'd rather not sit with. "The grant alone," she said finally. "Was that federal pass-through for harbor infrastructure?" "Yes. And the deed is in his name." "His name. Filed in July." She was quiet again. I could hear her breathing, small and controlled, the way she breathed when she was recalibrating without wanting anyone to know she was doing it. "Your father would like to have dinner," she said. "I know Dad would," I said. "That's not the same as you wanting to have dinner." "I would also like to have dinner," she said, and the words came out slightly uneven, like something that had been rehearsed and was now being delivered off script. "I'll talk to Daniel," I said. "I'll let you know." I put the phone down and sat with my coffee for a while. Meridian walked across my lap and settled in the crook of my arm. Outside, the neighborhood was doing its quiet morning things, a dog somewhere, a car pulling out, the particular still quality of early spring air coming off the water. I wasn't triumphant. I want to be accurate about that. I was tired in the way that people are tired after something they've been carrying for a long time finally gets set down somewhere. Not happy, not vindicated exactly, just lighter. The weight had changed character. Over the next several weeks, the calls continued. Petra called on a Tuesday, which I'll note only because of how out of character it was. Petra did not call without a reason, and this call was purely relational, which was its own kind of data. She said she'd heard Daniel speak at the gala, and she thought he was impressive. She said it in the flat, factual tone she used for genuine assessments as opposed to social ones. I said thank you. She said Griffin had done some research into the Reyes Maritime Center and thought the revenue model was well structured. I didn't ask what that had to do with anything. I let her say it. Warren called twice, once with his careful, apologetic warmth, once with a specific question about whether Daniel might be interested in meeting for coffee. I told him I'd pass it along. Daniel said yes without hesitation, which did not surprise me but still landed warm. My mother called 3 more times in the first month. Each call was slightly different in texture, slightly less formal, slightly more willing to ask rather than state. She asked about the coalition project. She asked whether we were planning to stay in Gulfport or whether we'd considered moving. She asked in the fourth call whether Daniel had family in the area beyond Rosario, and I told her about Aurelio, about the boats, about the 30 years on the water. She listened without interrupting, which was not a thing she usually did. None of this was the grand reversal you might expect. She did not cry on the phone. She did not say she'd been wrong in one clean sentence. That was not who she was, and, to her credit, she didn't try to perform a version of herself she wasn't. What she did was show up, incrementally, in the small ways that constitute an apology in the language of people who have never learned to apologize directly. The trust account was not restored. I didn't expect it to be, and I hadn't asked. What had been redirected, and that was a fact in the world, and I had built a life that didn't require it to change. What I had instead was my grandmother Vera, who called me on the evening of the gala. She'd heard from Irene, who'd been there, and said, in her 81-year-old voice with its particular coastal Florida cadence, I knew he had something. The water people always do. I laughed at that. It was the first time I'd laughed since the previous morning. You're good, Nadia, she said. You are always good. I know, Gran, I said. Your mother knows it too, she said. It just takes her longer. She needs to get there from the facts. She's always been like that. I thought about that, getting there from the facts. The building with the name above the door. The deed filed in Pinellas County. The grant proposal executed with clarity and follow-through. The 2 words at the dinner table, 14 months ago, in the calm voice of a man who already knew what he was building and didn't need anyone else to know it yet. That's fine. It was, I thought. It really was. Here is what I've carried with me since that year, turned over and looked at from different angles until it felt true, rather than just useful. A person's worth doesn't broadcast itself. It doesn't need to. The people who need to announce themselves loudly are the ones who require the announcement. The ones who are simply quietly doing what they do, building the thing, maintaining the boat, asking the right question, sitting still at the table when the pressure comes. Those people don't need you to believe them. They've already decided what they're doing. My mother was not cruel. She was legible. She made a decision based on the information she had processed in a framework she'd been using her whole life, and she pursued it with the same efficiency she brought to everything. That's not a defense of her. It's just the truth. The cruelty was real, and it landed where it landed, and I carried it for 14 months. But I don't think she is, at her core, a person who wanted to harm me. I think she is a person who had confused what mattered with what was measurable, and it took something she couldn't ignore to begin to uncross those wires. Daniel never said I told you so. Not once. Not on the morning after the gala, not when the calls started coming, not when Warren had coffee with him and came home and told me later he'd cried a little in the parking lot, which was more than my father had cried in 20 years. Daniel just noted it when it was noteworthy and moved on, the way he did with most things. That, too, was a thing I kept. That's my story. A dinner table, a 2-word answer, and a name above a door that changed everything my family thought they understood. If you've been dismissed by someone who should have known you, who had every chance to see you clearly and chose not to, I want to ask you something. And I genuinely want to know, so please drop your answer in the comments. Did they ever come back to you? And when they did you let them in? And how did you decide? And that's it for me. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.